everyone for joining us for the Credit Suisse and Empact Pro Bono School on cash flow management, strategies, and forecasting. We're very happy to see participants from Singapore, Hong Kong, and a few other countries. And we hope that, with today's session, you leave with some simple tips and strategies to be able to better manage your cash flows. For those who have joined us, I also want to remind you that throughout the session, please feel free to post any questions you may have for our speakers in the Q&A function below. For sharing, if you have any resources or comments that you want to share with our fellow participants, please use the chat function. Yeah. For those of you all who probably aren't very familiar with Empact, maybe just a quick introduction. We are a Singapore-based social enterprise. Peter, if you just want to move the slides. Yeah, our core focus remains on building capacity of our social sector leaders and staff. And one of the key ways in which we achieve this is by gathering knowledge and insights on specific needs in the sector, contextualizing this knowledge and our guided frameworks to leverage our corporate partners like Credit Suisse to bring skilled volunteers and topical experts to address some of the critical needs in the sector. It's exactly like how we're doing today with cash flow management. Now, this would not have been possible without our partners at Credit Suisse. So we would really like to thank them to support Empact in delivering this session and enabling us to reach out to a big group of nonprofit organizations and social enterprises across the region. Our partnership with Credit Suisse has been ongoing for the past few years now, and we hope to see, to be able to reach out and support even more social sector organizations throughout the year. What started back in 2017 and 18 as a pilot has now taken shape as an ongoing program to leverage Credit Suisse's expertise in critical areas such as finance to address some of the pressing needs we see in the sector. Now, we at Empact actually started this program called Pro Bono School almost 5 to 6 years ago. And our vision of starting this program really was to create a school of some sort for social sector leaders. Our community of corporate volunteers help us look at some of the key domains and functions that are required to build the foundation of our social sector organizations through sessions like these. In the past, we've conducted sessions on some of the different domains that you see here today. We've done marketing, we've done innovation and productivity, IT and finance, HR, and so on and so forth. But for today's session, we're really diving deep in the domain of finance through cash flow management and forecasting. Speaking of which, just to let you guys know in terms of why we even, come up with this topic, and, this is a repeat that we've done from the last year as well. Regardless of whether this was COVID or not, I think most organizations do face a lot of uncertainty and inconsistency in cash flows. Now, this could come from, your delay in grants or even your revenue for that matter. And not just this, but this is also coupled with, the lack of experience or professional training in managing cash flows among some of the organizations and the staff. Right. So which kind of leads to, no knowledge of best practices or even, ways in which how you should be doing this, which is why we kind of come up with this topic so that today organizations can learn about effective and efficient ways to manage cash flows in organizations, especially we've all been impacted by COVID, but now this is not just about COVID, but even beyond that. Right. So how do we actually go about efficiently managing our cash flows? For today's session, the way we will kind of run it is we will start with cash flow forecasting. So just teach you all a little bit of, the basics of cash flow management and also walk through the template, after which we will touch on, the strategies to deal with cash flow challenges in specific. And towards the end, we will park some time for Q&A as well. So please make sure you guys prepare a little bit of your questions that you have for our speakers, or feel free to put them in the chat and the Q&A function as and when you have them along the way. Yeah. Now, for that, without a further ado, I would now like to invite our first speaker, Mr. Peter Yang, who is also the founder and CEO of Empact, to share a high-level context on the topic. Peter has had extensive experience in supporting the social sector, and prior to Empact, he was also, a part of the financial advisory sector. So he spent about 8 years in this industry. And yeah, so over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Parnita. Yeah, very happy to have the opportunity and see many of the organization or many friends we have here today. Like Parnita mentioned that before I even start Empact, so my job is about helping organizations to look after their cash flow, teaching my clients about how do they manage cash flow, right? And interestingly, last year when COVID happens, I find myself spending a lot of time working with my finance colleagues about cash flow, right? Because usually we start maybe we're doing monthly cash flow monitoring, but during the peak of COVID, when things becomes really slow, and we started doing even weekly cash flow. So we thought cash flow management is a really important topic for many of the nonprofits and the social enterprises. Hence, together with Credit Suisse, we quickly put together a cash flow management series last year, and this year we are trying to combine quite a few of the topics here for today. So hopefully that you can take away some knowledge, some tools, and also get your question asked in terms of how you can learn some of the best practice, or gaining some practical tips to manage your cash flow, right? So yeah, this is go without saying, cash flow is really important. I think many of us may have experienced something like this, delay in grant disbursement, reduction in our revenue in donation, or sometimes cost of delivering program has increased, because we have to increase cleaning, have sort of screening and etc. So the cost has increased, right? So that cost constraint, or that require us put in more cash to manage our day-to-day in a short term. But mid to long term, and I think we have been in the COVID situation one year plus, and then nobody knows what will happen in a few months time, right? So doing the uncertainty about what is the financial situation going to be like in the wider society, how do we manage the uncertainty that is affecting our organization? And also, I think the new norm gives opportunity or require adjustment to us as well. So how do we operate in this new way, right? So what is cash flow management? I think cash flow management at the very basic concept is about the process of tracking and forecasting how much money is incoming and how much money is outgoing. So the objective is really, end of the day, managing cash is making sure that you have sufficient cash to pay for your costs, right? Very much like our personal finance, right? Want to make sure that at the end of the day, you have money to buy whatever you needed. In terms of timeline basis, cash flow usually is quite different from our traditional finance function, because finance is really looking at the past, right? Looking at the past record, recording the number and making sure that it is accurate. But from a cash flow perspective, is really looking ahead, right? Looking ahead and to forecast what you have cash, in a week's time, in a month's time, to pay whatever you need to pay, right? And the last part is the interesting thing, as I mentioned in my own case, the frequency is very dynamic, right? So if you have a lot of money, unfortunately, sitting in your bank, possibly you don't need to do cash flow management as frequent. But if you are facing some delay in grants disbursements, you are facing some large outlay of cash that you need to pay, frequency of monitoring it more frequently is really important. Right. So I would say this is just a very basic kind of overview, and what we will be covering today is 2 out of the 3 cycle of cash flow management. And the first part being really about tracking and monitoring, right? Know how much cash you have right now and be able to forecast how much cash you would have in the nearer period. So that is the first step, getting clarity. Second step is knowing possibly where you end up with, right? So what are the strategies or what are the options that you can use to make sure that your cash flow is healthy? And the last but not least is about implementing these strategies. This is not going to be covered by today. So we'll be focusing on tracking as well as the strategies, right? So maybe before I start, maybe need you to take out your phone to do a quick poll to say that, to tell this statement in terms of when your organization is able to manage your budget, it means that we are managing our cash flow well, right? So tell me that whether you think this statement is true or false. Okay, great. We have answers coming now. So I'll give maybe 30 seconds more. Okay, we have about 30 response. Okay, interestingly, currently majority of you said this is not correct. And while we have about 40% is saying that managing spending within your budget means that you are managing cash flow well, right? Okay, maybe we will just end here. And the correct answer, according to me, is that this statement is actually not correct, right? So it's a false statement. 40% of you may ask me why this is not correct. And the concept is that cash flow management is really different from budget management, right? So if I just look at a few components, from budget management, the purpose is really making sure that you spend within what you have, right? But that doesn't tell you that what is the time period and how much money you have. So the purpose of cash flow management is really making sure that the timing matters, right? So you have enough cash to pay when they are due, right? So the purpose is quite different. And in terms of the timeline, budget, usually you will set a budget for a period of a year, right? So that's quite a long period, whereas cash flow is constantly happening every month, every day. There's cash come in and cash come out. So it's important to make sure that the availability of cash for now and the future, in the near future, in the longer future, the timeline is important to set, right? The third thing is about budget is usually concerned with income and expenditure, which is more an accounting concept, whereas cash flow is very much like our personal bank statement, is based on the real money come in and out. So, and the last part is about the accuracy. Budget management require very accurate figures, right? So I would say that it's a single source of truth, right? So based on the approved number and based on what you can or cannot pay. But from a cash flow perspective, it's really about the assumption you made, because what we are trying to do is forecast the future, right? And none of us know exactly how the future will turn out. So inevitably, we will have to make assumptions, and these assumptions may or may not turn out in the way how we wanted it to be. So in terms of accuracy, it won't be as accurate as the budget management, right? So go back to the early statement to say that if you are managing your budget well, that only means that on a whole year period, you manage to spend within the limit, right? But that doesn't mean that you will have cash all the time to pay the money. That is another level of details that we need to study. Okay, so that's the first statement. Okay, second statement, same. Take out your phone and tell me whether this statement is true or false. Managing cash flow is my finance team's responsibility, right? Okay, obviously it's for those of you who have a finance team, right? I understand some of you may be the one who's doing multiple jobs and including taking finance and operation role. But assume that you have a finance team. Is this statement correct? All right, we have 30 plus responses, and 70% of you saying that this is false and 27% saying it's true at this moment. Okay, so the correct answer is that this statement is false, right? Yes, I would say that finance team will play a significant part in managing cash flow because they probably have access to bank statements. They know, what are the things need to be paid, and they know what are the invoice that you have issued, and etc. Yes, finance team plays a big role in doing this. But however, the finance team are not the ones who are interacting with your customer, interacting with your donor, or probably if you get grants, right, usually it's your program team that is responsible for meeting the KPI, right? So the finance team wouldn't know when the KPI has been fulfilled or whether at all you have fulfilled the KPI. So the cash flow management, I think, is everybody's in the organization's responsibility, whether they are in charge of the money come in, is donation, sales, grants, or those departments that are spending money, right? In terms of your manpower cost, in terms of your supplier cost, in terms of your fundraising cost, right? So it is really delegated the responsibility. And later we will touch a little bit about that. I put this concept here is because many of you have asked in your registration form to say, who should be responsible for cash flow? And in my organization, it's the same. Our finance is just the driver for the process. But my finance people rely on all the client managers to inform the finance when the payments will come in, and if they foresee there's any issue to fulfill the ground KPI, or the ground maker is just for some reason very slow, they could serve as a chaser or inform the finance people about the timing of the money. Okay, so last question. State important thing project to that it is accurate as possible. Is this statement true? Okay, we have the majority of you believe this is true, that cash flow projection needs to be as accurate as possible, right? But unfortunately, that's not the correct answer. Sorry, this could be a bit tricky. I pick up this question is especially many of you have said in your registration form that your concern and you find the challenge is to ensure the accuracy of the cash flow projection. So I'm not saying that you don't need to make it as accurate as possible, but to me, because the future is also uncertain and none of us can predict whether the assumption is true or not, spending most of the time making it accurate may not be the best time to spend, right? So later in the training, we will share a little bit about how to manage this uncertainty. And to me, it's really about a robust cash flow projection model that you can run what if scenario, like what if, your donation dropped by 10%? What if your sales has come down, right? What if your ground makers delay the payment? Do you still have enough money to pay? So yes, you need to try to make the cash flow projection accurate, but I would advise you to spend more time to build a robust cash flow forecast model so that you can use it to predict the different parts of the future and make decisions accordingly. All right, so just the last reminder for this basic concept about cash flow. I think the bad news is for many of you who are nonprofits, really there are very limited options in terms of cash flow management as compared to the business have, right? Business have the possibility about investment, about the loans, about many financing instruments that you can use, typically a business will use to manage cash flow issues. But unfortunately, NPO can't get investment. Very rare cases that you can borrow a loan from the bank. And I think that's very similar for early stage social enterprises. And then, but on the flip side, this also means that it's really very few things that you need to learn to be able to manage the cash flow. And I also would say, we designed this training more from a layman perspective. You don't need to know about accounting. You don't need to know about finance. And it is as simple as long as you can read your personal credit card statements or bank statements and be able to planning your own personal finance. And I think you will be able to master cash flow management for your organization, right? Okay, so for the first part, as I mentioned, that I will take you guys through how do we create a cash flow forecast or project our cash flow and how to build a robust financial model so you can anticipate and forecast the different future scenarios, right? And usually the objective is really about making sure that you know how much cash you have now and in the future, so you spend within your means and ensure your cash flow is sufficient. And most importantly is helping you to make decisions, right? Making decisions based on possible scenario that likely to gonna happen, and how we are doing that, right? So there are tools that are available in order to help us, so you don't have to start scratch, right? So there are two types of tools. One type of tools is really Excel based, which I will say is quite popular among many small organizations, and we all know how to use Excel, but probably we just need to build a model. So there are templates available for nonprofits, and we have built a model as well that we can share after the training with you, so you can use the templates just to adapt for your organization, right? Apart from this, nowadays we have cloud-based apps that will make the task a little bit easier. But the con is that maybe that you have to pay, you have to fork out a budget on a monthly subscription basis, or usually they are a little bit more complex to configure, right? So for today's training, I will just focus on the Excel-based template, and I will share a little bit of the best practice about the cash flow projection, as well as using a real case study to walk you through the model. Okay, so first part, what will be considered a good Excel-based projection, right? So there's 4 points only. First point is that whatever the projection that you are doing, it has to be aligned or mirror your organization structure or financial management, so that it's easy to use the data you already have from your accounting side or in the past records, right? So that's first, being aligned or mirroring your organization structure. Second, I can't emphasize this enough, and your model has to be dynamic, as little, it should be more formula-based and less hard-coded, right? So you can easily update it from time to time, so you don't have to spend all the time rekeying numbers. But once, if your model is formula-based, when you key in one number, the rest should just be calculated by itself. The third thing is that usually people don't like to read financial model, is because as a human being, we can't read so many numbers, right? Probably 1 or 2, but if you gave me a line with 20 numbers, it's really hard to comprehend. So usually the output of the model should be very understand it rather quickly. And the last part, as I mentioned a couple of times, it should be able to run scenario planning and run the what if analysis. Yeah. Okay. So so I will just introduce the case organization that I will gonna show. This is just a dummy example. And based on a nonprofit kind of situation. But if you are a social enterprise, I think largely the principles are the same, even though maybe the setup is slightly different, right? So this case study organization is called Future Kids Ready Kids, right? So their mission is to help kids from low-income family to be future ready. And they have a few programs. They do digital literacy class, right? And it's free for kids from low-income family. And the way they sustain it is through grants funding. Another program they are running is life skill training. So similarly, kids from low-income family, they don't have to pay for it. And they rely on donation to sustain or cover the cost of running. And last but not least, they do camps, right? The camps, and any kids can join, free from the low-income family, but it is chargeable. There's a revenue model for other kids to join, so they have to pay for a program fee to cover that cost, right? So these are the top 3 revenue generation, and with different kind of funding sources. So this is their budget, right? That budget, like many of us do, projecting that our budget will have about 750K income, and the cost is budgeted to be 700K, and there will be a surplus of 50K at the end of the year. In terms of the monthly cash in and cash out, this is just rough estimation based on the past. It's about 63,000 cash out is about 58,000, and then each month you have a positive sort of cash inflow about 5,000. And currently they have a pretty healthy bank balance with 90,000 in the bank, right? So projection always looks great, right? But in reality, there are some challenges they are facing, like many of us may be able to resonate. First, their reduction in revenue, right? So especially during COVID time, some of the grant makers are repurposing, or donor repurposing their money to more health-related or emergency-related causes. So there might be a chance that the revenue will come down. And also because they have to turn the camp into digital format, and home-based learning may not be the best for the kids, so maybe the sign-up rate may not be as much as they forecast, right? And on the cash flow front, many of us are experiencing the similar things, right? If there is a delay in grants, then or even just delay in grants disbursement due to we can't fulfill the KPI, or there's some timing issues, how would it affect their cash flow? All right. So these are some of the challenges this organization face. Right. So then shortly I will turn and switch to the Excel model, but before that I just want to create a basic concept. So based on the Excel, there are a few sheets. Right. The first sheet is really containing all the assumptions that I have made, right? As the assumption that may turn out to be true or not true, or you want to change the assumption, you can easily do so on these assumption sheets. Then you will have your profit and loss, which is calculated a number based on your assumptions. And then you have your cash flow, is also based on the assumption. And the results will be shown in a summary sheet. And the last but not least, there is a scenario sheet as well, right? And when I show you the model, you will see that there are the cells are color coded differently. So usually I will try to highlight to people that what the meaning of the color coding, right? So for example, the green ones is really that assumption I put in that can be changed. Second is that if it's a purple background, it means heading. And then if it's a white background, means that it's calculation cells that doesn't change, right? So you don't have to manage it constantly. Okay, so these are just some of the basics. And let me toggle to the Excel itself, right? So as I mentioned, these are the table of contents, and you can see there are different tabs, right? So let me walk you through this assumption sheets, right? So assumption sheets usually covers our revenue assumption, our expense assumption, our cash flow assumption, right? So when you look at the revenue assumption, right? So there is donation. For example, we forecast 20,000 that we can get from a month-to-month basis. As you notice, that green sort of colored cells are assumption. So these are the numbers that I can change very easily. Right, I better not change it. Right. So the purpose is really highlighting to us, knowing which are the things you can change, which are the things you should stay constant. Okay, so yeah, we have grants, sort of assumptions. We have other assumptions. So basically, this is just the assumption sheet, right? And then we come to the profit and loss. So once your model is set up properly, you don't need to do anything. Everything it will be calculated from your assumption sheets, right? Like, I don't need to do anything, the number will come. And when I change the assumption, the number will update automatically. And then I also have my cash flow sheets. Yeah, this is the cash flow statement. As I mentioned, it's really automatic. You don't have to do much. Once the template, you have gotten a template and template is set up correctly, you don't have to do much, right? And now I'm toggling back to the summary sheet. Maybe I just wait for a couple of seconds. Yeah, hopefully you can see. So the summary sheets usually is about the summary of all the results which are important for us to read, right? We have the revenue breakdowns, and in terms of percentage, in terms of total expense, we'll have the breakdown of the different percentage and net plus surplus or loss that you have. And it is also represented visually, right? In terms of revenue, more than half is about donation, 39% is about grants, and really small portion of program income. And in terms of expense, like many of us, manpower is really the majority of the cost, followed by some program costs and as well as office costs, right? So this is very much about profit and loss, right? Understanding the revenue and expense. For today, the context, which is more important for us today, if I scroll down, is about cash flow, right? So knowing, looking at a graph, which will easily tell us the green bar is what's the cash come in, and the red bar is the cash outflow. And the purple line is really the balance, the closing balance, whether I have positive or negative cash balance, right, on a month-to-month basis. So as you can see from a graphic perspective, it's a lot easier to comprehend as compared if I would switch back to the cash flow sheets about the various numbers that you need to read, and they are not very readable. But once you put into a graphic format, it's a lot easier for us to comprehend visually. Company that I also have some of the cash flow overviews with opening cash flow, closing cash flow, and very importantly, just knowing what is the average in and what is the average out, and monitoring what is the lowest point in my bank account, right? So I think based on the graph, the lowest point is about September 2021, which I have 35,000 here based on my current assumption. And also in terms of number of how many months I can survive at the ending cash flow without any income, right? So that's just an indication about how much risk I can withstand, right? Switching to the last but not least is about scenario planning, right? To look at a different scenario. I have pre-run the model just to save some time, but that kind of is a sheet where I capture the different scenario. What will happen if my donation reduced by 50%? What is my lowest cash balance? What is my profit is going to be like, right? So that is a little bit of structure of the model, right? As I mentioned earlier repeatedly to say, for a model, the most important thing is not to make sure that this set of number you have on the screen is most accurate, right? In fact, it will never be accurate, right? So what do we do with this is really tie in the numbers with your business objective, right? So for some of us, if we are the finance function, or some of us have board members, right? So the board usually would ask, let's say if we cannot meet our fundraising target this year, what will happen to our cash flow, to our P&L, right? So if you are the person trying to figure out the answer, it's very easy using the model. Okay, I'm gonna toggle a little bit. Hopefully it's easy. So as you remember at the beginning, I have said that in the assumption sheets, you have the revenue assumption, especially the donation assumption. Yeah, so currently it's about 20,000 we've forecasted, right? So what if it doesn't really run very well, right? Let's say it is dropped by 50%, right? So then I can only achieve 10,000 a month, right? So what happens, right? Once I change the assumption, I go back to the summary sheet. Hopefully it shows on your screen on the summary sheet about cash flow. Interestingly, the number changed quite a fair bit, and we do have one period, I believe in April 2022, the lowest cash in the bank is about 8,000, which means that you will run out of money in one point in April 2022, right? So that gives you a little bit of sense, like what will happen if donation become lower, right? You can run various scenarios by changing the assumption, right? So due to time, I probably will not run every single ones, but just want to letting you know that you can play around with the numbers, especially the green colored number, even if you delay in grants timing, right? So you can say, instead of getting 10% in month 1, I can get 10% in month 3. So you play around with various factors to determine the risk that you're gonna take. Yeah. Yeah, I have some pre-run numbers here. As we talk about donation reduced by 50%, I will have negative cash balance. If the camp attendance demand drop, right? Less people attending camp by 50%. As you can see, it doesn't really affect my lowest cash balance. It will only affect a little bit of my profit and loss for the year. And if my grants delayed for 3 months, it will affect my cash balance, lowest cash balance, but I will still have a positive cash if this happens, right? So this is really, really a very useful exercise I would encourage all of you to do whenever you think there is a risk for a certain future, using your financial model to tell you what is the results of that risk, and to assess whether this is something that you can manage within your operations, right? And I will show one last trick that we always use is that at times we may ask another question to say that, what is the how much lower that my donation target needs to be to make sure that my minimum cash in the bank is above 0 or equal to 0, right? So what is the lowest target I need to set for myself in order to not run out of money, right? So for some of you who will know that in Excel, there's this function under data tab, and under there is a what if analysis. Okay, I will go slowly in case my screen doesn't follow up. Okay, there is a what if analysis on the toolbar, and there is a goal seek function, right? So the goal seek function basically allow you to say that at what donation level my cash will become 0, right? So you seek the cash in the bank becomes 0 by changing the assumption of your donation number. Okay, so as you can see, after I run the what if analysis, my lowest cash in the bank becomes 0, and my donation become 10,800. So this is the minimum donation target you need to achieve on a monthly basis in order to make sure that you don't run out of cash, right? So yeah, so that's another way of playing around with scenario analysis, just to derive the answer and the clarity for yourself that what do you need to do to manage the risk in the future. Okay, so I will switch back to my slides.
Peter, maybe before we just quickly move on, I think there's a few questions from our audiences. I know we will be inviting our next speaker very shortly, but just very quick questions on the template. So one is, can some of these expenses be clustered or categorized as, some of those expenses that might be fixed and some might be variable? That's one. And I think the second question was on scenario planning. Two things actually. One is, can the scenario planning also be done for expenses, meaning not just for income? Similar, can that be done for expenses? And I think the other question was, is it ideal to also include your historical data maybe in your financial model, or is it really just meant for forecasts?
Right. Okay. Great questions. I think yes, you can definitely run scenario planning for your expenses, right? So yeah, I showed on revenue, but definitely you can play around with your cost data. Right. For example, if you can see that manpower cost is really the major cost that we have, right? I think some of you in the registration form ask, what if we're going to hire one more person, right? Hire one more person. Can we really afford that one more person, right? So let's say your current payroll monthly is cost 40,000, right? What if you hire one more person that maybe costs 5,000, right? So you just simply change the assumption to 4,000. 500, and you go back to see what's the picture like, right? So if you are on the summary sheet where I am on, so after hiring this person, your lowest cash in the bank is become 20,000, right? So which means that you can still manage the person's salary from a cash flow perspective. From a P&L perspective, of course, you know, your year end will turn out into a loss situation, right? So which means that you might have to do something with your revenue or other cost. Yeah, so in fact, you know, you have to run both revenue and cost and other timing assumptions in order for you to play around. Yeah, so that's one question. And the other question was about whether do we need a historical number, right? And in order for us to do the forecast, right? I think that's a very good question. From a cash flow projection point of view, I mean, from the modeling point of view, right? The most important thing of the past figure is like currently how much money you have in your bank based on the starting of the forecast, right? And as and when you go each month, as when you go, you can decide into two formats. One is that instead of having this month one, okay, let me turn here. Instead of having this month one as a calculated figure, you can update some of this to become an actual figure. Just to make sure to compare at the end of the year, you know, whether your sort of forecast is as close as your actual. But this will require quite a bit of how should I say, quite a bit of skills knowing how to tweak the model, because to break the formula usually requires quite a bit of work. Hence, I would say that for me, I will try not to put a historical figure into the model. I will always look for 1 year in advance, right? So let's say this model is about 12 months a period, right? So as months pass, I would just always look forward, right? So let's say now it becomes August, right? So if I want to change my August, so I just need to change my dates, if you can see my, and it automatically updates the date. And for certain assumption, you might just need to review them and to see whether some of the assumption need to change based on the new kind of starting date forecasting forward. Yeah. There was another question. Sorry, I forgot. What's the other question?
Yeah, just on the scenario planning, can that be done for expenses also?
Yeah, that one answered. Yeah. Is there another one?
No, I think that should be it then.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. So there was, I think that's part of the question. I understand it was there's a fixed and variable component. I think that is very much possible if, let me see. Let's say, you know, in this model, there is some fixed monthly expenses and there's some variable, right? So let's say this expenses is 20% of the based on the program income. So the formula is set up such that this 20% will be calculated based on your actual program revenue, and 20% of that revenue will become the cost. So yeah, yes, the model you can set up fixed and variable. The difference is really just the formula is different. Yeah. So yeah, so after this training, we will send this model to you. You guys can play around it with it. We will send you a clean version of the model, which there's no data at all, so you can set up your own organization's data. And we will also send you this case study so that you can play around with a model that already has a number, right? That will show you the movement of the figures. All right. Maybe before I end my segment, I'll just recap a little bit of key learning points for all of you. I think, as you can see from the financial model, right, it's really the structure has to mirror your organization, right? Knowing what's your income, what's your expenses, and when you're going to get them. That's one. Second, as you see, the model I'm showing you is very dynamic. I just need to change a few things in the green box, and the rest of the things will run by itself, right? It saves a lot of time. Using visual, and we only usually read charts, right? Much easier to understand. And last but not least, your model should be able to run scenarios and then allow you to keep the different scenario results so that you can compare them and understanding what are the key risks of your organization. Okay, so with that, I finished the part quite quickly about forecasting future cash flow, and I think this usually takes years of practice. Yeah, so if you are not finance trained person, don't, or not Excel may not be your thing, but don't be too scared. And I think once you play around, you will get the hang of it. Okay, Parnita, back to you.
Yeah. Now, for our last part, I'm going to invite Peter back, given his vast experience in managing nonprofit organizations and social enterprises in the region. So I'm just going to invite him now to share some of these strategies and how can we actually contextualize and apply them to the social sector context. Yeah. So over to you, Peter.
Yeah. Thanks, Vivek, for sharing the commercial side of the consideration, largely, in terms of what organization need to do, or some just the simple tips, right? So I think today's audience, we're not only having social enterprise, but also a nonprofit organizations. So I think I was just leveraging what Vivek is mentioning to a little bit of the nonprofit sort of context. So for me, when I help clients and nonprofit organization looking at their cash flow management, I think, for me, that is my mental model, looking at income, looking at the expense, and looking at the reserve, right? So the simple thing is really just looking at, is there a quick way to increase the income, right? Whether there's an opportunity to reduce the expense or reduce the cost, as Vivek mentioned. And also for some of the organization who is really not having enough income to cover the expenses, can we tap on the reserve that we have built in the past, right? So maybe just on each of the building block, and maybe I just share some of the top strategy that we see that has worked well for nonprofits in terms of the increasing inflow. I think it's very interesting that we have seen that during the COVID situation, especially when you have some challenges, really appeal to your existing donor is much easier strategy because they already know you, right? So like they said, whether they reach out to your board member, your founders, your founder, and all the stuff. Talk to people who already have a relationship with you. So I think that usually works well vis-a-vis, run a crowd fundraising campaign, etc., which may take time to manifest the results, right? So that's first. Second is really about generating or making appeals for emergent and urgent needs, right? So when disaster happens or when a certain situation or like COVID that we all can relate to, if you can speak about the needs very well, and then people can understand the situation, and usually these are successful ways to drive donation in a very short period of time. For example, I think many of you may relate to, when COVID switched for many of the children to do home-based learning. And many of the low-income family doesn't really have the infrastructure, the laptop, and the situation. So there were a lot of calls for donations to buy equipment, or even donation of the equipment, to meet that needs. And I think I have seen there was very, very good response on those. And then many of the foundation has launched COVID-specific funds, and then usually they were over donation beyond their initial target. For some of them, they even 300%, 400% based on what they already wanted, right? So make a special appeal, it makes sense. And last but not least, many of us receive grants, whether it is social enterprise or nonprofits. I think negotiate with your grant makers. They are not your customers, and they are usually more sympathetic to our situation, right? So if you can't really meet the KPI because of, due to timing, or due to you have to restructure your program and etc. I find that many of the grant makers were very sympathetic in terms of towards relaxing the criteria, or allowing some form of early disbursement of their grant money as much as they can, right? So these are the three things on the revenue or income side, right? So yeah, so this was another example last year, as I mentioned, that there's a specific COVID call which generated a lot of response. On the outflow side, right? So how to reduce outflow? I think first I do think getting in-kind donation to offset your budget to the cost could be a very good way to go. This is one of the example last year. Marina Bay Sands in Singapore, large hotel, large resort donated 15,000 kg of food to charity, right? Just to offset the cost of buying food, right? And usually this is something that we overlooked, right? Because we usually wanted the cash, but actually, understanding where your expenses are, finding in-kind items that can offset the cost, which can be a very powerful way, especially some of the SMEs or some of the organizations don't have extra cash during the moment, but they do have goods, do have resources they're happy to share. So that's one. And second is about like Vivek mentioned, stretch the payment timing, really managing if your credit terms, people give you 30 days. You don't have to pay them early, right? So really monitor and manage and then timing the payments within the credit term, or sometimes even renegotiate the payment times that you can with the vendor. And many of you are charity, I think it's slightly easier given that people will understand the purpose of the organization is different from a baseline business, right? And the last but not least, I think if the situation is really challenging, right? So I would say that a reduction of manpower cost should be considered, but at the last result, I think many of us, especially those who are in high cost locations like Singapore or Hong Kong, manpower cost is usually the biggest cost for any of us. And I think there are mechanisms, to look at the manpower cost, right? It doesn't mean that reduction of manpower cost is to let go of your staff, right? It could be, change working hours, looking at whether have a smaller percentage of bonus or temporarily have a pay cut and etc. Those are all possible means. And the last, if nothing works, then maybe looking at reducing your headcount. But I think this is really something that you will be very effective in terms of outflow management. And yet there's a significant impact on your organization. So also do think about using this very carefully, right? So the last part is really tapping on the reserve cautiously, right? So one is, I know some of the, especially charities that there are charities with a lot of investments, right? Whether it's fixed deposit, some do even invest in equity and bonds and etc. So yeah, to during uncertain times, it will be good to improve the liquidity of your investments, right? And converting them to fixed D, or just more selling these and make it into your available cash for you to use. And then also repurpose some of the restricted funds to general funds, because some of the charity may have funds, money sitting in your bank account, and because the purpose is restricted, so you can't really take the money out. And we have seen there are organizations who have convinced their board and have a legitimate way to repurpose these restricted funds, especially talking to the donors or talking to those grant makers who have designated the purpose of the funds, and usually they are quite open to looking to the repurpose of the purpose. And the last but not least, I think just review and adjust the reserve policy, right? So yes, it's great to have a 2 years worth of cash reserve, but do you really need that much, given that there is uncertain period at this moment? So you'll also be cautious to see what is the reserve policy, during a time when cash flow may be quite challenging, right? So yeah, so I would say these are the strategy is very much very much very short-term things that we need to look after. But I think to mid-term or maybe even longer term, it was never just about managing the cash, right? Managing the cash is just making sure that you can tie through, you can pay things. But the longer term, the fundamental need to work, right? So the fundamental about your business model, even though you are a charity, the business model need to work, right? So it's about redesigning what you have, what you are offering. And what we have seen in terms of some of the distress cases, and I think a lot of time is really about reprioritize which programs are more mission critical, right? So certain things, demand has dropped and etc. So it's about reprioritizing the portfolio and managing costs from reducing the offering perspective. So that's one. And second one, it could just be, how do we deliver the program more productively, right? So can we use less resources? Can we use technology so that we reduce the cost of program delivery? And last but not least, just finding ways. I mean, that is kind of buzz word, but in reality, maybe a bit harder to do is really finding, is there other ways to achieve the mission instead of your existing portfolio of programs, right? So yeah, so I'm just contextualizing some of the commercial best practice into maybe some of the tips for the nonprofits of a charity perspective. Yeah. So yeah, that's about it. I pass my time back to Parnita.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter and Vivek, both for sharing such great insights, on how organizations can implement simple strategies to manage their cash flows better. We do have some time for questions, from our audiences. So maybe I can quickly jump into those. So one of the attendees has a question on any tips or advice on building and adjusting forecasting scenarios and cash flow strategies based on, available data in the Excel sheet. And I think what they're trying to ask is how often should they actually review adjustments that need to be made, especially if the organization is very young and, and very lean as a team. Yeah. Vivek, maybe you want to take that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I totally get it. There are many NPOs very lean, not have manpower resources. In fact, I currently sit on the board of an NPO which is very lean. We only have one temp staff who works on a half-time basis or part-time basis. So it is challenging. I think if your question is, how much time you should spend on this, well, first of all, you should ideally be familiar with the process, familiar with your Excel spreadsheets. If you are doing that, then I wouldn't recommend spending too much time. We, in fact, look at our cash flows only on a quarterly basis in the NPO that I was referring to, and adjust accordingly. Of course, you would need to know at least an annual plan when you start the year. So in our NPO, we look at our strategic planning or forecasting first on a 5-yearly basis, so that we know where we're exactly going in 5 years. Number two, then we look at it on an annual basis before we start every year. And number three, for that particular year, we adjust it on a quarterly basis. So I hope that answers the question. Now, specifically how you should adjust in the Excel spreadsheet, I'm not sure I can really answer that without looking at the spreadsheet, but maybe Peter, I don't know whether you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I maybe I just want one thing to add. I think generally, if you have sufficient cash, you are not in distress. I think, cash flow forecasting the frequency doesn't have to be as often, right? But if you are really in distress and you only have maybe 1 month of reserve to meet your daily obligations, and for some of the organization, I know that your cash flow is a bit more lumpy. It doesn't go on average. Let's say if you largely rely on large grant disbursement, then you might need to monitor a little bit more often, just to make sure that one or two, income or outgoing amount doesn't really affect too much of, you will not be too stressed about it. I mean, I myself have gone through this before, a long time ago when we were largely, we have large sort of grant disbursement. Well, and anyways, in Singapore, sometimes the grant makers, the process is so long, right? So they promised, 1 month, but in fact, we got the cash in 5 months. It caused a lot of stress for us. So I would say it's really depends in those situations. Then we really do have to monitor very frequently, but not so much using the Excel spreadsheet, but it's really practically to say, table all the invoices I need to pay in the next 2 weeks, and monitor bank balance to say which one I can pay, which one I can stretch a bit more time, right? Salary, unlikely you can stretch much, but some of the money or things that you want to spend, can you delay it and can you defer it? So on a very practical kind of terms, especially I think for very distressed organization. And just to add on from the financial modeling point of view, I think it's very much about this is more for planning purpose, right? To look at the future and answer some of the big questions. But from day-to-day, distress point of view, as I mentioned, you practically just need to table all the things that were coming and going out, get all the key stakeholder, internal stakeholders sit down and to say, hey, are we going to get this money by this date, right? If not, do chase the clients and telling them that we need the money from this point of view. So you don't really need the template I just shared because that more maybe too longer term and too high level. And if you are really in distress, you really need to look at itemized planning.
Yeah, there's another question on, if you all have any tips or strategies on how organizations can move restricted funding to general funding, since that was one of the tips as well.
Maybe I can share my experience in that. I think all of us have been facing this in the last couple of years. I actually, in our NGO, we went back to the donor who gave us the restricted funding. And we negotiated with the donor whether we can use that restricted funding to general funding purpose. I think it depends on each donation or each funds that you have, where it's coming from, and what was the purpose of it. For this particular case, it was the President's Challenge, the grant that the government provides to many NGOs in Singapore. And I think they are very flexible. Then they totally understand the situation. And they say, okay, if you can't use this within, say, 2 years' time, provide us an update as to why you couldn't use it and what are you going to do with this, right? So with the proper justification and request, you are able to move that restricted fund from the restricted funds to general funds. So it is quite possible, but you have to have the dialogue with the donor or the funder to make sure that they understand your situation. I think every donor who has given you money will be sympathetic to your situation and hopefully receptive to the idea.
Great, thanks, Vivek. Yeah, I know this is perhaps not such a cash flow related topic, but any ideas that you all might have for nonprofit organizations to grow recurring donation?
Maybe Peter, you would like to take that?
I think it's a challenging question, right? So we all want recurring donation. I think in my experience, I think, well, one thing is, just try, right? Never try, never know, right? Because a lot of the organization I have met is that they would like a recurring donation, but yet their infrastructure, the online things are not really set up for recurring donation. So it's not like people don't want to do recurring donation, but when I click the donate button, it leads me to giving.sg, which is a one or sometimes a one-off campaign donation, right? So if that is your priority of recurring donation, I would say prioritize the infrastructure and the call out to the donor in that manner. I think this is something that you can control. Second thing, I think, is really about building the product. What is the product that will attract people for recurring donation? I would say that sometimes the appeal of the donation will be great to match something. There is a need for recurring donations, so people can understand the purpose, that why they are contributing a percentage or a fixed amount every month, right? So not using church as a case, but they have a purpose about how you can set aside your 10% of your income or 5% of income, on every month to donate, right? So there is a purpose behind that, and I think if your organization can build a purpose or build a product, so to speak, behind that, it will be a lot more compelling for the donor, right? The last bit, I have seen the successful case study is start with smaller amounts, right? Maybe maybe start with $5, $10, vis-a-vis, ask for a lot. So every one of us feel like $5 per month, it doesn't sound like lot, or $10 doesn't sound like a lot per month basis. So and it will take more trouble to cancel it, right? So I would say, make the amount smaller to get in there. Yeah, and then you have to spend less time. You don't have to worry about these donations. Yeah, so I recognize it's quite a challenging thing to ask people to give indefinitely and on the monthly basis.
Thanks, Peter. In the interest of time, I'm just going to take one last question, and if you can just very quickly respond to this. For organizations that probably don't fully utilize the grants they receive in the stipulated time frame, would you recommend they return the balance amount if it's not specifically mentioned in the grant agreement?
My suggestion is be transparent about it. As NGOs, especially if you're a charity, transparency is key. So reach out to your donor, even if the grant agreement didn't specifically specify that, and then make sure that they understand your situation. They may say no comment, or they may actually restrict you, but at least you would be able to say that you were transparent about it. And in my experience, donors appreciate transparency more than anything else. They want to give money to organizations who are transparent about how they conduct business and how they use the donated money.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Vivek and Peter, for addressing some of the questions we've had from the audiences, and especially sharing insights on just overall cash flow management and forecasting. Now, with that, we've come to the end of today's session.